There is a place in northwest Ohio that, for most of the 1800s, simply defeated the people who tried to live on it. It was not a mountain range, and it was not a desert. It was flat, green, wooded country, roughly 1,500 square miles of it, larger than the whole state of Rhode Island. And it stopped American settlement cold for 2 full generations, long after the land all around it had filled up with farms and towns. The settlers had a name for the country they could not tame. They called it the Great Black Swamp. In 1836, a French immigrant named Peter Gull built a cabin at its western edge, in what is now Fulton County, Ohio. He was one of the very few who dared, because the real fight, the fight to actually drain this swamp and turn it from a graveyard into farmland, would not begin in earnest until 1859. And once it began, it would take the better part of 30 years, 15,000 miles of hand-dug ditch, and more men buried along the way than the county records ever troubled to name. I want you to hold on to Peter Gull, because there is one more person you need before we go any further. 30 miles east of Gull's cabin, in the town of Fremont, a boy named James B. Hill was born in 1856. He would grow up to spend his 20s and his 30s as a drainage tiler, standing in this exact mud for a living, and he would end up building the machine that finally beat the swamp. Peter Gull belongs at the beginning of this story, Hill belongs at the end of it, and in between them lies 3 decades of the hardest, wettest, sickest work in the history of the American frontier. One fact explains both why this land was so valuable and why it was so deadly. It was almost perfectly flat. The whole region sat in the old bed of a glacial lake, Lake Maumee, the ancestor of Lake Erie. When the great ice sheet pulled back at the end of the last ice age and the lake drained away, it left behind a plain that falls only about 4 feet for every mile. Think about that for a moment. 4 feet of drop in a mile. Water that lands on ground that flat does not run anywhere. It sits. It soaks in. It stands in the shallow hollows until the fallen timber rots underneath it and the water itself turns dark. That black, still water is exactly where the swamp got its name. The old lake left one more thing behind, and it is the reason anyone got in at all. As the water dropped over thousands of years, it built low sand ridges across the flatland, its own former beaches, standing a few feet higher and a little drier than everything around them. Those ancient shorelines were the only naturally dry ground in the whole region, so the first footpaths followed them. The first roads followed them. The first cabins and the first little settlements clung to them. If you look at the oldest routes across northwest Ohio, you are very often looking at the beach of a lake that has been gone for 10,000 years, because that beach was the one place a wagon would not sink. And I want you to sit with just how empty this place stayed, because it is the strangest part of the whole story. Ohio had been a state since 1803. By the 1830s and 40s, American settlement had rolled straight past it and on into Indiana and Illinois. Pioneers were breaking prairie hundreds of miles to the west, and yet here, in the northwest corner of one of the oldest states in the Union, sat a block of country 100 miles wide that was still very nearly wilderness, still timber and standing water and fever, decades after the land around it had been fenced and plowed. Settlement did not conquer the Great Black Swamp. For 2 generations, it simply went around it. The reason it went around it was death. Every summer, the fevers came off that standing water. The settlers called the worst of them the ague, the shakes. Violent, teeth-rattling chills, then a burning fever, then drenching sweats, a cycle that came back again and again and could put a strong man in bed for an entire season or lower him into the ground. We know it now as malaria, carried by the clouds of mosquitoes that bred in the still water and hung over the wet country all summer. The people living there had no idea about the mosquitoes. The doctors of the day were certain the sickness rose up out of bad air off the marsh, and they were completely wrong about the cause, which meant nothing they did could prevent it. By one account out of Paulding County, 5 out of every 6 settlers who came to the swamp came down with the fever. They fought it with the one thing that actually worked, even though they did not understand why. Quinine. It came from the bark of a South American tree. It was bitter enough to make you wince, and families in the swamp kept it close, because it was the only thing that could break the fever. And the ague was not even the worst of it. Cholera moved through the region too, and typhoid, and cholera could empty a cabin of an entire family in a matter of days. There is a name attached to that horror that I cannot forget. Benajah Wolcott, the first keeper of the Marblehead Lighthouse near the swamp's Lake Erie edge, died of cholera after burying the bodies of victims that had washed ashore. The place earned a grim nickname that stuck. They called it the graveyard of the Midwest. And the fever did something crueler than simply kill. It defended the swamp. The ague struck worst in the late summer and the fall, which was the exact stretch of the year a settler most needed his strength, the season for clearing timber, for burning brush, for opening ditches before the winter. A man shaking with fever in September could not swing an axe or lift a spade, and so the very sickness that rose off the standing water also made certain the standing water would stay. Whole families went down together, husband and wife and children all bedridden in a single cabin, with no one left well enough to nurse the others or bring in what little crop there was. The swamp was not some passive obstacle sitting patiently, waiting to be cleared. It struck back on a seasonal schedule, and for a very long time, it kept the upper hand. You could not even cross the place. In 1827, they finished a road through the region called the Maumee and Western Reserve Road. On paper, it was a road. In practice, people called it the Mud Pike, and it earned a reputation as the worst road on the continent. 31 miles of it ran through the swamp, and along those 31 miles stood 31 taverns, roughly one for every mile, because a single mile could take a wagon the better part of a day, and a traveler needed somewhere to collapse at the end of it. Wagons sank to the axle. Horses foundered in the mire. The swamp did not merely resist farming. It resisted travel. It resisted the mail. It resisted the simple act of getting from one side of it to the other. So picture the whole situation honestly. You have some of the flattest, blackest, richest bottomland soil on the entire continent, the kind of dirt a farmer would trade years of his life to plow. And sitting on top of it is a shallow inland sea of mud and standing water, 100 miles across, grown up in timber 8 feet through at the base, breeding a fever that struck most of the people who tried to settle it. The soil underneath was worth a fortune to anyone who could reach it and farm it. And for most of a century, the price of reaching it was your health, and very often your life. That was the entire problem, and nobody had a way through it. What finally cracked it open came down to 3 plain things: a law, a shovel, and about 30 years of men willing to stand in the swamp water and dig. If you appreciate the depth of these American industrial heritage stories and want to support more of them, join at the Boss tier for early access and members-only polls, or Final Boss for member shoutouts and members-only videos. Link below. The path to that shovel ran through the State House, and it began earlier than you might expect. Washington actually tried to help first. In 1850, Congress passed the Federal Swampland Act, which handed millions of acres of unwanted swampland over to the individual states, on the simple theory that if a state owned the swamp, it would sell that land and spend the money to drain it. Ohio itself had already passed a first general drainage law back in 1847, but those early efforts were weak, scattered, and mostly toothless, and one by one, they failed to move much water at all. It took another decade of failure before the state finally wrote a drainage law with enough force behind it to matter. In 1859, it did. That law was the Ohio Ditch Law, and it changed everything, because it solved a problem that was never really about engineering at all. It was about cooperation. Let me walk you through why that mattered so much, because it is the hinge of the whole thing. Draining a swamp is not something one farmer can do alone on his own quarter section. Water does not respect a property line. If I dig a ditch to drain my land, and that ditch dumps its water onto your land, I have not solved anything. I have just moved my swamp downhill onto my neighbor. To actually drain the Great Black Swamp, thousands of separate landowners spread across a dozen counties all had to dig connected ditches, running the same direction, falling on the same grade, all the way to a shared river outlet. Organizing that by neighborly goodwill alone is close to impossible. The ditch law made it possible. It gave the county commissioners the power to lay out an official drainage district, order the main ditch dug, and then divide the cost among every landowner whose ground that ditch would drain, whether that particular landowner wanted to pay his share or not. It sounds like a small, dry piece of county paperwork. It was the key that unlocked the entire swamp. Once a county could compel a shared ditch and spread the bill across everyone who benefited, the water finally had a legal path to somewhere, and the digging could finally begin at a scale that matched the true size of the problem. Men were hired by the rod, that is, by the length of finished ditch, and paid by the day, and the work went on season after season, county by county, for decades. That power to compel was not always welcome, and it is worth being honest about that. A drainage assessment was a bill a farmer could be forced to pay for a ditch he had not asked for, and the old county ditch records are full of the arguments that followed: petitions begging for a ditch, protests fighting against one, disputes over who truly benefited and who ought to pay how much. But the swamp left no room for the gentler alternative. A patchwork of farms where every man drained only when and where he pleased would have just chased the water in circles. It took the blunt authority of the county, the power to declare that this ditch will be dug here, on this line, to this depth, and that all of you will share the bill, to finally hand the water one single continuous downhill path to the river. And the digging itself was brutal. I want to be very precise about what this work actually was, because it is easy to say the words hand-dug ditch and picture something neat. Before the machines arrived, every one of these ditches was opened by men with spades and long-handled shovels, cutting down through wet clay and heavy black muck, one bite at a time. A main ditch might run 3 to 6 feet deep, and the largest ran deeper still, 20 feet across at the top and narrowing to 6 or 7 feet at the bottom so the walls would not slump back into the cut. Smaller field ditches were spaced roughly 100 feet apart across the farms, and the men who opened them stood almost waist-deep in the wet and the mud, all day long, often in cold rain, working in the very same swamp water that carried the fever they were trying to escape. This was the wettest, filthiest, most bone-punishing labor on the American frontier, and it did not happen in one heroic summer. It ground on, year after year after year, and the sheer quantity of it is the part that stops me cold. Before the machines ever arrived, this entire region was opened by hand, and by the time the main work was finished, Northwest Ohio held something on the order of 15,000 miles of drainage ditch. That is more than 5 times the distance across the whole continent, from New York to California and a good way back again, every mile of it cut into wet clay with hand tools, one spade of muck at a time. Add in the buried tile, and the total length of man-made drainage in the region runs into figures that are genuinely hard to hold in your mind. No single crew ever saw more than a tiny piece of it. Each gang simply dug its own stretch, in its own township, in its own bad season, and then moved on to the next. Here is what those careful county records do not give me: the names. A county ditch book is a precise document. It records the length of every ditch, the width, the depth, the grade, the cost per rod, the exact assessment charged to each landowner. Those books kept the mileage and the money with real accuracy. What they almost never kept was the name of the man standing at the bottom of the cut with the shovel. We know that immigrant labor did an enormous share of it. Irish and German men, some of them the very same crews who had dug the great canals a generation before. We know they were paid by the rod and the day, and that many of them caught the fever they were draining. But as individuals, the great majority of them are simply gone from the record now, remembered only as so many feet of finished ditch. When I read those ledgers, that is the thing that stays with me. The ditch survived, the name did not. And a ditch, on its own, was still only half of a drainage system. An open ditch carries away whatever water reaches it, but the water sitting out in the middle of a wet field still has to travel across the ground to get to that ditch, and on land this flat, it will not make the trip on its own. The answer was buried drainage tile, underground pipe that pulls the water down out of the soil and carries it sideways to the open ditch. The earliest versions were not even pipe. A farmer would lay 2 wooden boards together in an upside-down V, bury that little wooden tunnel in a trench, and let the water find its way through the gap. Those improvised wooden drains rotted out in 8 to 15 years. But for those 8 to 15 years, they worked, and they turned a drowned field into a field a man could actually plow. Then came real clay tile, and this is the point where the swamp genuinely began to lose. Clay tile is fired pipe, laid end to end in a trench a few feet down, and where you buried it, it drained a field permanently and silently. The water table dropped, and the black bottomland finally became exactly the farmland everyone had always known was hiding down there under the water. Demand for tile exploded across the region, and the swamp counties started manufacturing it themselves, out of their own clay. In Paulding County, The first tile mill opened in 1876, run by two men named E.P. Williams and W.F. Straw. It was the start of a whole local industry. By 1884, the State Agricultural Board counted 109 miles of field tile already laid in Paulding County alone. By 1892, there were at least 20 tile mills operating across that single county. There is something fitting in that picture. The county was digging its own clay out of the drowned ground and firing it into the very pipe that would drain the ground it came from. And the tile itself came in a whole variety of designs, shaped and fired from the local clay, and then buried a few feet down in trenches cut just for it. Think about what that industry actually meant out on the ground. Draining one single farm did not take one ditch. It took a ditch to carry the water away, and then hundreds upon hundreds of feet of buried tile feeding into that ditch, every foot of it dug in and laid by hand. A farmer might spend years tiling a single field, one stretch at a time, as fast as he could afford the pipe and spare the labor from everything else. Now multiply that one farm by every farm across a dozen counties. There was no ribbon to cut at the end of it. It was an entire region quietly replumbing the ground beneath its own feet, field by field, for nearly 40 years. If you're new here and enjoying this kind of historical depth, subscribe so you don't miss the next video. We publish new videos every week. Now I need to talk about the trees, because this is where the usual picture of clearing the frontier gets the story exactly backwards. When most people imagine settling a forest, they imagine the felling, the axe, the two-man crosscut saw, the great trunk crashing down, and there was plenty of that here. This swamp grew timber on a scale that is genuinely hard to picture today. Oaks and elms and ash so massive at the base that when a family finally got one down and burned away the top, the stump left in the ground could be enormous. Some of those stumps were so wide that farmers hollowed them out and penned their hogs inside them. Pulling a single big stump, with oxen and chains and levers and days of grinding effort, was a battle all its own. I have told the story of that battle before on this channel, the sheer punishing labor of the stumps. But here is the correction, and it is the beating heart of this entire story. On the Great Black Swamp, clearing the trees was not the real fight. It only looked like the fight, because it was the part you could see. A family could fell every tree on their land, and burn all the brush, and drag out every last stump with their oxen, and then stand back and admire their cleared field. And that field would still be underwater. The trees were the part of the job a person could see. What actually decided whether anyone could live there was the water underneath, and no amount of chopping and burning and stump pulling touched that water at all. That is the thing that sets this place apart from an ordinary frontier clearing. Everywhere else in America, you beat the forest and you had a farm. Here, you beat the forest and you still had a swamp. The real war was always the drainage, the war of ditches and tile, and that war was painfully slow. And while it was slow, the swamp kept right on winning. And it kept winning for a very long time. Decades into the fight, with the ditch law long since passed and thousands of miles of ditch already dug and clay tile going into the ground every season, huge stretches of the region were still wet, still feverish, still half-drowned. Hand labor, even organized under the county, even relentless, could only move so much earth in a season, and the swamp was vast. What the fight needed in order to finally tip was a way to dig faster than a man with a shovel ever could. And that brings me back to the boy from Fremont. James Hill had grown up inside this exact problem. He had spent the 1870s and 1880s working as a drainage tiler across northwest Ohio, which means he knew the misery of this work in his own hands and his own back, standing in the wet cut and laying pipe by the foot for a living. And out of that direct, muddy, first-hand knowledge, he built something genuinely new. In 1894, Hill patented a machine he called the Buckeye Traction Ditcher. It was a steam-powered, self-propelled trench-digging machine, and the clever heart of it was the digging wheel. Hill designed that great wheel with no axle and no spokes at its center, an open ring of cutting buckets, and that open design let the wheel cut a deeper trench, at a clean and perfectly uniform grade, in one single continuous pass. Grade is the whole game in drainage. A ditch that does not fall steadily and evenly just holds the water in place instead of moving it along, and cutting a true, even grade by eye and by shovel had always been the very hardest part of the handwork. Hill's spokeless wheel cut that grade automatically, every time. The result was almost unfair to the old way of doing it. That machine, run by just 2 men, could dig a properly graded trench in less time than a crew of 15 skilled men working with shovels. 2 men doing the work of 15, at a better and more reliable grade, without the ruined backs and without a summer of fever. The swamp had held hand labor to a standstill for 30 years. The machine broke that deadlock in a handful of seasons. Hill's road to that machine wound through the small towns of the region. He started out in a machine shop in Bowling Green, then moved the operation to Deschler, then to Cary, and finally settled it in Findlay in 1902, where a local foundry built the ditchers, and the enterprise was renamed the Buckeye Steam Traction Company. From Findlay, the machine was shipped out across the country, and, before long, around the world. And behind it, the very last of the swamp itself was going dry. By the turn of the century, the swamp that had turned away settlement for 2 full generations was all but gone, converted into some of the most productive farmland in the entire United States. And the transformation of the region was almost total. That same black bottomland that had drowned crops and bred fever became, inside a single generation, some of the most valuable farm ground in the entire country, growing corn and wheat and later soybeans on soil that farmers in other states could only envy. The little settlements that had once clung to the old sand ridges spread out and filled in the townships between them. The route that travelers had cursed as the mud pike became an ordinary country road running dead straight across dead flat fields. Drive through northwest Ohio today, and you cross some of the calmest, most orderly farmland in America, mile after mile after mile of it. And almost nothing you can see from the road will tell you that a swamp 100 miles across once sat exactly there, or that it cost 30 years and thousands of forgotten men to make it vanish. I love one small detail from the end of Hill's life, because of what it says about this kind of stubborn, practical genius. When he later took his ditching machines down to the soft, waterlogged ground of Louisiana, they bogged down and sank. So Hill designed a new kind of wheel that could carry heavy iron over soft ground without sinking into it. He called the design apron traction. That idea, a moving belt that carries a machine across ground too soft to hold up an ordinary wheel, is a direct forerunner of the modern tank tread and the tracks on every crawler and bulldozer you have ever watched work. The wheel that an Ohio drainage tiler invented in order to conquer a swamp became an ancestor of the tracks that would later cross battlefields and building sites the world over, all of it running straight back to one stubborn problem. How do you move heavy iron across ground that wants to swallow it whole? So the swamp was drained, and the story could end right there, on a clean note of triumph. But I do not think that is quite the honest ending, and the reason is that phrase I keep returning to. The swamp kept winning for decades, and in truth, it never entirely stopped winning. Because water sitting on land this flat does not just leave and stay gone. It has to be actively and permanently pushed away, forever. Everything I have described to you, the ditches, the tile, and Hill's machine, did not remove the water once and for all. What all of it really built was a system that fights the water every single year. A system that has to be maintained without a pause, or the swamp quietly comes back. And this is not a figure of speech. Wood County, Ohio, which sat right in the heart of the old swamp, today maintains more than 3,000 miles of drainage ditch. That one county has more miles of ditch than it has miles of road. Some of those ditches have to start 12 or 13 feet deep just to hold enough fall to keep the water crawling toward the river on that flat ground. The Great Black Swamp was never really destroyed. It was pinned down, held under by a machine of open ditches and buried tile that has been running without a break for more than 150 years. And the work never truly ends, because the water never truly gives up. Out of those 3,000 miles of ditch in Wood County alone, several hundred miles sit inside an active maintenance program at any given moment, walked and measured and cleaned out by county engineers and ditch technicians whose whole job is to keep the water moving. A ditch left alone silts up. The banks slump inward. The grade goes soft, and the water begins, very quietly, to stand again. Everything the hand diggers and the tile layers and Hill's machine accomplished has to be renewed, decade after decade, by people most of us will never meet, in a fight so old and so constant that it has faded out of sight entirely. The men who first cut these ditches believed they had beaten the swamp for good. They had not quite. They had won dry ground that their descendants would have to keep on defending, year after year, with no end anywhere in view. And there is a real cost written into that victory, one that I think honesty requires me to name. When the settlers drained the swamp, they had no way of knowing they were also draining one of the largest wetlands in North America, a natural filter the size of a small state that had been quietly cleaning the water headed into Lake Erie for thousands of years. Today, only about 5% of that original wetland still survives, in a handful of small scattered preserves. The same drainage that grew all that corn now sends farm runoff straight down those ditches into the lake, and that is a large part of why Lake Erie fights the algae blooms it fights today. I am not standing here telling you the drainage was a mistake. The farmland it created feeds an enormous share of this country, and the people who dug it earned every acre. I am telling you it was a trade, an enormous one, made by people who could not possibly have seen the full size of what they were trading away. Both of those things are completely true at once, and the reverent thing to do, I think, is to hold both of them in your hand together. So here is where I land, after all of it. The Erie Canal gets remembered. The Transcontinental Railroad gets remembered. And the 15,000 miles of ditch that drained an inland sea, buried a fever that had been killing families for generations, and built some of the richest farmland anywhere on earth, dug foot by men whose names the county clerks never once wrote down, gets almost nothing. There is no monument you would recognize on a drive, no famous painting on a wall. Just the corn, growing quiet and green on ground that used to drown people, and a county with more ditch than road, still holding down a swamp that most of the people driving over it every day have never even heard of. I think that work belongs in the very same breath as the canal and the railroad. You may think I am overselling a great many drainage ditches, and if so, I genuinely want to hear it. Because Peter Gall built his cabin on the edge of that swamp in 1836, and somebody ought to still remember why that one small act took so very much. Before we close, if this kind of pre-modern engineering story is what you came for, the final boss tier at $9.99 gets you members-only videos plus your name in upcoming uploads. Boss tier at $4.99 for early access. Link in the description. Thanks for watching to the end.